Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jure Ayoub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. Or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. Hey everyone. You're about to hear a conversation with my good friend Maya. The audio is probably not the best, but it should be fine. The reason why it's not the best is that we recorded this fairly quickly, as I wanted to have a sort of reaction episode. Sort of reacting to what's been happening in Palestine in the past week. But I have to emphasize, please, in advance, that this is not a news update. For the most part, we do not speak about what is happening on the ground in terms of like the details. We do reference them, of course. But the reason why I didn't get into that is simply practical. It's not easy. I've been doing it largely online, on Twitter for the most part, and I'll continue doing it there for now. Our conversation was about a number of things that I won't even really summarize now because I don't think I'll do a good job at it. If you do listen, I would ask you to go through the entire thing, if that's okay. I would, as always, be very interested in your feedback, so feel free to let me know. By email or private message if you have my contact, or on the website. This wasn't an easy conversation for me to have, for the simple reason that I tend not to want to talk too much about this in public, but I have found the format of the podcast rather convenient for doing so, because I can sort of repeat myself and make mistakes, and then it will be obvious to you guys that this is a stream of consciousness sort of situation. With that in mind, I wanted to remind everyone what exactly is happening now, and I think in order to do so, because I'm not there, I will just read you a Twitter thread by Jihad Abu Salim, which he posted a couple of days ago, and here I'm reading what he said. My sister just texted me, Hanmoud khalas, that's it, we will die, due to the intensity of the situation. My sister was 8 during the 2008 war, 12 during the 2012 war, 14 during 2014 war, 18 during the March of Return, and now she's 21 during this. She does not deserve that. My grandmother is in her late 80s. She experienced the Mandate, the Nakba, wars of 56, 67, 73, and in Lebanon she lived through 78 and 82 invasions, and after she returned to Gaza, she lived through 2 intifadas and wars of 08, 12, 14, and now this aggression. My mom was a child when she witnessed the invasions of 1978 and 1982 in Lebanon. She was born during the June 67 war, right after Israel occupied Gaza. Her whole life has been of war and pain. We are born into trauma. We live through trauma. We inherit trauma. We pass trauma. Trauma stress disorder is never post. It's always now. It's continuous. It's endless. I am so sick and tired of people who treat Palestinians as if they are abstract characters in a fictional self-serving narrative created by a propaganda machine to justify Israel's actions. We are human, our lives are valuable and precious and significant and important. It's not fair or just or human or decent or honorable for this world to accept a reality in which Palestinians have to pay for Europe's crimes and for the West's regional geopolitical interests and for Israel's existence at the expense of our life. We are tired, we are exhausted, we have been neglected, avoided, ignored, mocked, criminalized, attacked, harassed, smeared and dehumanized for long. Enough is enough. They ruined our country. It's on them to fix it. We're not going anywhere. Oh, and I have a brother with special needs, a survivor of a car accident when he was a child, who has severe seizures and who suffers from sounds of explosions and their impact. What do I tell him on the phone when he asks why this happens? What do I say to him? Answer me, please. I haven't seen my family in 8 years. I left Gaza to start a graduate program in the US. I got married here to an amazing Palestinian woman who hasn't been able to meet my family yet. My family attended our wedding on FaceTime. We don't know if we will ever be able to see them. I am so sick of how our existence is made impossible. that living, just living, is made impossible. Impossible to travel, to have electricity, water, visit, fly, play, live in peace, without wars and fear. Why is it hard to just be able to live? End quote. I will link to this thread, of course. So, folks, as I said, this is not a episode only about what's happening now. It's actually more of a chat between two friends, as Maya and I have been friends ever since we met while we were both doing our masters at SOAS in 2015, 2016 in London. I hope it's beneficial to you. I hope you gain something from it. If you're in Palestine, I'm thinking of you. I hope this nightmare ends, and I hope we find a way to find a just peace for everyone. Take care, folks. Okay, thanks everyone for listening in. This is a pretty special episode. We're recording it as things are unfolding, and so it's not going to be as structured as some of the other episodes. I have with me here my good friend Maya, and Maya, if that's okay, first I'll ask you to just introduce yourself, and we'll just take it from there.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Maya Schkolne. I was born in Haifa, but have grown up in South Africa. I now teach high school students from across the continent. Yeah, that's who I am.
Awesome. So Maya and I met at SOAS several years ago, and since then we've been in touch on and off to discuss several things. Obviously, lots of personal stuff, which I will not be sharing here, but other stuff of more relevance, I think, to our conversation are our, uh, specific positionalities and mixed identities and kind of being in between multiple worlds at the same time and that sort of thing. And it's something I wanted to bring up in the context of what's happening right now in Palestine. But I want to emphasize just before, like off the bat, that this is not a news update. This is not an episode where I'll just be detailing what's been happening, especially in the past week. For one, just there's just too much, and I don't have the resources to do so. For two, I'm just gonna link up a lot of relevant stuff in the description for those who do want to follow, inform themselves and that sort of thing. So with that in mind, um, okay, so I think it's useful to state our positionalities from the start so that listeners can tell that this is a fairly uncommon conversation. And if that's okay with you, Maya, I'll just start with myself.
Absolutely.
I come at this from this question. I'm gonna call it a question from a number of sides. I grew up in Lebanon, as listeners know by now, I think, but feeling mostly Lebanese because my Palestinian side was effectively repressed. And I mean, people who know of Lebanese history might know why. For those who don't, super briefly, during the Lebanese wars, what's usually known as the Lebanese Civil War between 75 and 1990, Palestinian groups were among the many sides that were participating in that war. I'm gonna totally butcher the summary of the war here, but I'll do another episode for that more specifically. Following the official end of the war, anyway, in 1990, part of the agreement between the Lebanese parties was essentially to scapegoat the Palestinians. They kind of came together. We agreed not to shoot each other anymore. We agreed that these other people won't have the power, or at least the potential power that they may have had. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But there's more than that. My family, my grandfather, who was born in Haifa, where Maya was born, and grew up there, was exiled in the 40s, in 48, in what we call the Nakba, i.e., catastrophe in Arabic. And obviously, I mean, as with many others, he was never able to go back. And as it happens, my grandfather passed away last year. Um, since his death, especially in the context of COVID-19, confinement, all of that, I had a lot of time to kind of reflect upon his legacy, his memory, his story, because he was a very complicated man, very problematic man as well. He was of his time, let's say. He had certain views that obviously I would not share. Um, but he also carried with him a lot of silences. He carried with him a lot of things that were not said rather than things that are said. And it took me a long time, several years, to kind of piece together certain threads that still needs to be filled. Like for one, for example, I know that there are Ayyubs living in Haifa today. I know of them because I've Googled them, so I know their names, I can see them and stuff, but of course I don't actually know if we're related or not because I haven't really explored the question, to be honest. But that's just one of many silences that I grew up with. My grandmother, i.e., his wife, my paternal grandmother, was originally from Italy, and for one reason or another, she moved to Palestine at some point in their 30s or early 40s. And for one reason or another, she moved with my grandfather to Lebanon at some point. She was married very young, like 14, 15. And so there is a theory in the family that my grandmother might be Jewish due to the specific region that she comes from. But my grandmother's alive. And I've tried to ask certain questions here and there, but I haven't really gotten anywhere. For one, she may just simply not remember because she was very young when she left. But it's just one of those things that I also inherited. I inherited a silence. And because of that, I found myself almost as if trying to reach out to this this potentially Jewish person who's alive, and everything. But because I couldn't talk to her, I ended up just reading a lot about Jewish history. That's essentially what ended up happening. And it just so happens that around the time I was doing that is when I met Maya, because that was at SOAS. SOAS Library generously have a lot of content that helped me kind of navigate that identity crisis, let's say. So that's what I'll say for now. I have more to say, but I'll stop for now. Maya, if you can sort of kind of, introduce yourself a bit more, also kind of, yeah, if that's okay.
Yeah. Sure, Joey. Some of those details I didn't actually know fully about before. So we really are coming at this with, yeah, a lot of stuff
Yeah.
connected to the issue. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, as you said, I was also born in Haifa, like your grandfather. Um, I spent my first few years on a kibbutz in the northern Galilee. My parents are South African, and they had been involved in a more liberal, kind of left-wing Zionist youth movement. I'll unpack those a little later. But it's because of their involvement in those youth movements that they then went and kind of co-founded this kibbutz, which is where I was, where they lived for many years and where I had my first few years in. But just like a bit of backstory is that my ancestors mainly fled Lithuania and Latvia, so mainly Eastern European. Some parts of my family are from Holland. They had earlier fled from Spain and Portugal, which is where like they were trying to avoid being forcibly converted to Catholicism, so they went to Holland. So and essentially, yeah, they all, like, parts of my family were able to flee, and then they came some safely to South Africa, which is what brought my family to South Africa. So I'm both kind of very connected to South Africa historically, but also like I have these connections to Israel that I've had to make sense of in my life. What those connections are, I will go into later. Yeah, but I grew up in kind of an Ashkenormative community, like white Jewish, and we were there at the brink of South Africa's transition to democracy. So yeah, I think like when I look back on my life leading up to there, I was primarily Jewish, and that was before I was South African, just because of my exposure. And then the more I got to know about my South African identity and how apartheid really fucked things up over here, the more it kind of led me also to question some aspects of my Israeli identity and how that could be connected to what this country has gone through. Yeah, so that's some of me.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, even like we didn't even say everything, but I hope this kind of shows a bit of a taste of how random this all is, in many ways. And yet, we met at a time in London when we were doing our masters at SOAS, when what ended up becoming my master's thesis, which was on the politics of Hebrew and Yiddish. Um, was still in its, I was still kind of thinking about it and mulling it over. And what's kind of interesting, I think, maybe some people might disagree, but what I found interesting at the time is that my initial instinct was actually to research Lebanon. And I wanted to research language politics in Lebanon because it's kind of an under-researched topic. But I felt like that was too close to home. I just couldn't focus. I had just left Lebanon in 2015, was in the middle of an uprising. I was heavily involved in it and I just couldn't focus, let's put it that way. So I chose something that for me felt like, well, this could be the furthest away possible. And yet, I mean, physically it's not, obviously, but mentally it is. And that's what I ended up happening. And of course, during that time, I learned a bit of Hebrew, which now kind of a bitter thing, but it's allowing me to translate some of the most horrible shit that I'm seeing on the ground. Although I'm not fluent, but I can read fine. And it just ended up being this additional thing. Since then, I'm not gonna go through the entire life story, but since then, I've tried to find threads that could potentially be linked, even though they won't be linked anytime soon due to the realities on the ground and due to primarily what the Israeli government is doing and has been doing for a long time now. But I have seen threads, for example, off the top of my head, and I'll get into it a bit more, of how the legacy of what we might call Jewish anti-Zionism or like Doikite, and we'll talk about this a bit more. Here-ness, essentially, that's what it means. Like where we are is where our identity is, where our homeland are, or homeland is. And I've found myself drawn to it, like to this idea, and some of the essays I've been reading from like 100 years ago and stuff, and finding similarities to my very peculiar life experience of not just the Palestinian side I just mentioned, but on my mother's side, it's the reason why I have the Argentinian nationality is because my grandfather was born in Buenos Aires, and the reason why he was born in Buenos Aires is because his father fled the Ottoman Empire. And so there were all of these threads that kept on connecting one another to the point where it just became almost as a joke. So I would just joke that, well, today I'm Italian and tomorrow I'm Argentinian and the day after I was born in France, so like, why not? Let's add some French in there. Obviously Lebanese and Palestinian too, and and I ended up just kind of playing with it in many ways. I didn't know how to. I didn't take it too seriously in a nationalistic sense, but I took it personally. Obviously, I tried to find links that maybe this made sense to me, maybe this might not. With the Argentinian, I haven't really found a huge link yet. Let's say, other than I speak Spanish and I drink mate, which is a bit funny. Um, with the Italian but with the Italian, then there's that additional link, which as of now is just in my mind because we've never proved it. It's just a story, it's just a potential story. And so when I read, I have the collected works, the full collected works of Primo Levi, who was, of course, Italian Jewish. And when I read his stories, not just his essays, but his stories, I somehow feel a kinship there in one way or another that I know might just be the Italian bit, but in my mind, well, maybe it's that other thing as well. But I can't prove it. And if I do one day prove it, not that it in itself matters, because I still have my lived experiences up until now, and it would just be another lived experience. But I would find myself in a position where I grew up Lebanese Christian, Lebanese Maronite, and Lebanese Greek Catholic specifically, which have their own super complicated threads of history. I then learned that I was also Palestinian, so that those two on their own are very complicated in Lebanon. Those who know about Lebanon know what I'm talking about. Um, but then if we add also potentially Jewish or some Jewish heritage, then in my mind it's like, well, this is just a joke. This at this point, if we're talking about all of those identities, it's like, James Baldwin has this very funny line that I quoted a number of times, where he was asked by this talk show host or whatever, so, Mr. Baldwin, you are what he would have said Negro, homosexual, uh, you were poor or something. Surely you must have felt that you were cursed. And Baldwin replied, well, no, I feel like I hit the jackpot. As a joke, of course. But it became that thing. It became a thing where I felt like this past that has been at times either haunting me or complementing my life, enriching my life as well. It's not all negative, of course. Is something that I just learned to deal with. At no point was ever asked my opinion. At no point was I ever asked, because the nature of the politics of the region is that the borders are there and they were drawn way before any of us were born, and we just had to deal with it, and that's it. So that's another dimension to all of this, but it's part of the reason why I have a lot of anger and I have a lot of definitely a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, a lot of sadness, but I no longer have much hatred. And this is something that, again, I sort of learned to kind of move beyond, largely because I felt that the hatred wasn't actually very productive other than being self-harming. And I'm not just talking about self-hatred, which can be a huge problem as a Lebanese Palestinian, as some Lebanese Palestinian friends would attest to this, but it's just hatred in general. So, okay. I want to be very clear, if that's okay, for listeners, because we're recording this at a specific date, May 15th, 2021, 2:22 p.m. Geneva time. So that's 3:20 p.m. in Palestine. I don't want what I'm saying now to be translated as, well, this is how I think things should be in Israel-Palestine. If I'm speaking about hatred, I don't want people thinking that, well, I'm referring to Palestinians hating Jews. Because I have to be very careful with all of this, partly due to those multiplicities and those multiple identities, because it's very easy to just put me in a box and then, you interpret what I have to say from the box. If I say fuck Israel, well, obviously he's going to say fuck Israel. He's a Palestinian Lebanese, so, these things kind of precede me. But I want us to get into the specifics of what do we mean specifically, the both of us, because I think we more or less have the same viewpoints on this when we talk about anti-Zionism. Because I think for me, and I will definitely let you expand, because in your case it's actually even more interesting, I think. My anti-Zionism has nothing to do with my Arab identity. I mean, to some level it probably does. I'm not going to claim purity here, but it's something that I learned. I didn't grow up with it. I adopted that position from a broader anti-nationalist position, and it extended from the anti-nationalist position first and foremost. And so the fact that I value anti-nationalism first is one of the reasons why I don't care, or actually even openly condemn, all of the quote-unquote pro-Palestine governments, like the Syrian one, like the Turkish one, naming Iranian one would be an obvious one. I don't care whether they say that they stand in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, because it doesn't do anything to me. It doesn't work. It doesn't appeal to me anyway. And this allows me to then see, well, what are they actually doing? Not just for Palestine, but obviously in their own territories. Syria is an obvious one. Iran is an obvious one. Turkey is an obvious one. And so, yeah, that's where I'm coming from. And when I have this episode with Daniel Randall, I'll just briefly plug. It was recorded long before it was recorded about a month ago, but it will come out in, I think, a couple of weeks or so, which was on the topic of left anti-Semitism, which we may talk about, but it's not my main focus here, just because that episode is already there. And in that episode, I also mentioned a lot of those prioritizing anti-nationalism and all of that. So I'll just shut up now. And Maya, if you can sort of talk about your own trajectory of how did you come to identify as a Jewish anti-Zionist?
Yeah. Sure, Joey. I was writing down so many notes to respond to you again, but I think, yeah, we can continue our conversation. Again, I'm kind of in awe at how complex all of this fits together. So, yeah, we'll get to that. So, yeah, I think for me, growing up, my version of Zionism came through less a kind of through nationalistic fervor, and more through kind of subtle things. So Israeli authors, that my mom was reading or that we had to read at school, though those were less interesting, like Israeli TV shows. We didn't even really have like JNF boxes in the home. So I would say we were,
Can you explain what that is for those who don't know?
yeah, so JNF stands for the Jewish National Fund in English, and it is an organization that attempts to portray an image of kind of greening Israel, and in particular the Negev. But actually, you know, over the years, through lots and lots of funding, it's been able to demolish homes and really be complicit in a range of crimes. But to young, I would say, Jewish Zionist homes, most of which are in the diaspora, much more than in Israel. I think we were very, like the institutions were very Zionist, and so yeah, even boxes like the JNF would collect money through these blue and green boxes that were like very colorful and pretty and appealing. And yeah, I would say those were the associations I had with the JNF when I was growing up. And that was kind of just how Israel became a part of kind of all of our identities, even without it being through like singing the national anthem, etc. But then I would say that I went to a youth movement, which I mentioned earlier that my parents had been involved in as well. There are a range of Jewish youth movements. Some of them are, I would say, neutral on the question, more neutral, quote unquote, on the question on Palestine, and more focused on like Judaism and its practice. But then other camps are much more right wing. Other camps are much more religious. The one that I went to as the kind of educational summer camps was a left-wing Zionist camp or movement. And we used to go for like every year in the December holidays during the summer in South Africa. And that was really where I started to learn about myself as a white person in South Africa through Habonim. And I would say this organization helped me understand myself in the context of the country that I was in, because up until that point, I'd lived a very insular, kind of bubbled life. And then because this movement was helping me understand other critical things in the world, I also trusted its approach to Israel-Palestine, because I felt like it was progressive in all the ways. Yeah, so growing up, I kind of adopted their position, which was that the what should be kind of denounced really loudly is the occupied territories and the occupation of Gaza, but never was there a discussion about Israel as an ethno-nationalist state and what that meant, and kind of questions around supremacy. That was never brought up. So I would say, yeah, for a long time, I thought that my approach to Israel was more or less like left-wing or liberal at different stages of my life. And then I started to kind of think, okay, wait, maybe there's something wrong with this kind of Zionist undertone in the education I got from there. And at the same time, I was learning about anti-apartheid struggle heroes who were Jewish. And I was really proud of, you know, people like Dennis Goldberg, Ruth First, Nadine Gordimer. And I was really kind of appreciative of the connection that those activists made to the social justice component of Judaism, which I think, yeah, a lot of my life, that was my exposure to Judaism, especially through my family, less through my school, was that, you know, during Pesach or Passover, we would talk about liberation, we would talk about freedom, what it means to be enslaved, and then what it means to become free from slavery. And so, yeah, I kind of wasn't questioning my approach to Israel all too much, I would say. But yeah, I think there are a lot of other things that happened. I'm not sure how much more I should go to for now, but that was just my growing up kind of experience.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I just took this note while you were talking. A lot of people, in my experience, whenever we speak about left-wing Zionism, simply dismiss it by saying, well, it's not really left wing. And for me, well, I would agree in theory. For me, it's sort of also a way of copying out and not dealing with issues of, racism, supremacy, or what have you within left wing movements, which are very much still a thing. And people can look up the history of the Labour Party in the UK. There's a number of other examples I won't get into now because it's not really the subject of our conversation, where things that are we might think of as right wing were done in the name of left wing causes. I mean, I can name the Danish government right now deporting Syrian refugees and them calling themselves socialists. That's another example. But I won't go down that rabbit hole for now. One another thing, let's say, from that year 2015 2016, when I would say I read more books on Jewish history, on Zionism, what have you, than I think I ever did since. I also stumbled upon, surprisingly, or it was surprising to me because I didn't know about it, the fact that some of these things I was learning were actually also being expressed by Palestinian intellectuals. So I have this unfinished essay. I've mentioned this like a couple of times just because I haven't managed to finish it yet, and I've been writing it for years now in some ways, of looking at the intersection between Edward Said, Mahmoud Darwish, Elias Khouri, other Arab intellectuals, focusing on the Palestinian ones though, and someone like Moishe Postone, who was a Jewish Canadian intellectual who passed away like 2-3 years ago, and Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who was an Israeli intellectual who passed away some years ago as well. Very different people, and in many ways, very different people, let's put it that way. But one thing that I found fascinating especially from both Mahmoud Darwish and Edward Said, there's this quote, or there's this scene in a movie by Jean-Luc Godard that's called Notre Musique, Our Music, that features Mahmoud Darwish himself. And he is speaking to this Israeli Jewish woman who is played by a well-known actress, but I forgot her name. And he tells her, like, so the situation is that the Palestinian is speaking to the Israeli Jewish woman. That's kind of how it's presented, and they're speaking to one another. And it's Mahmoud Dawi, so he talks a lot about poetry. He talks a lot about he's looking for the poet of Troy because Troy never got its poets because they were destroyed, etc., etc. And at some point he said something that just stuck with me as soon as I watched it. I watched the scene. I discovered the scene before watching the movie. And he says that the interest in us Palestinians stems from the interest in you, the Jews. Essentially, is how he was mentioning it. I.e., and then he expanded upon the interest in the Palestinian question comes from the interest in the Jewish question, and that was like one thread in my mind. It's like I want to do something with that idea because I think it's very powerful. Because what it says that the statements that we're hearing today, from Biden to Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, make a lot of sense if one remembers that they don't actually view Palestinians. The story is not about Palestinians. The story is about what Europe did, essentially, what the West did during the Second World War, as obviously I'm referring to the Holocaust. So that was one thread. Then the other thread, which is Edward Said's thread, is that I don't know if he coined it, but he mentions this terminology a number of times of like Palestinians are not just victims, but they are victims of victims, i.e., they are victims of a people that were historically victims of the Jews. And this, for me, gives a nuance that, for the most part, I don't express online because the internet is not a place for that, for the most part. But, okay, I'll phrase it this way. The hesitation to discuss it that way, as victims of victims, I think comes from a misunderstanding that nuance equals justification. That nuance equals, well, if you're trying to understand where, or even if you acknowledge that there might be trauma on the Israeli Jewish side, then but that by definition means that there's some kind of justification for what they're doing, and that, for me, that kind of thinking is in itself what many people have called like a scarcity way of thinking. Like there's only room for one thought at a time. Essentially, there's no room for nuance. Essentially, and the word nuance is so misused often that I even struggle to use it right now, to be honest. but it gives me this added leverage in many ways. And the way I try and frame it to people who are willing to listen, which isn't that many, is that I want my end goal as someone who is anti-nationalist, anti-militaristic, etc., etc. I mean, I'm an anarchist, to say it bluntly. Um, is I want uh, the collapse, essentially, or the dismantling of hierarchies of power and of oppression. Zionism is a pretty obvious one, the way especially it's been manifesting for most of its history. At least the dominant ideas of it, to be super extra nuanced for no reason right now. Um, so part of my goal is that I want to find a way, in the same way that I was looking for ways via Syrian networks to how to weaken the Assad regime, how to increase the costs on the Assad regime. I want to weaken the IDF. I want to find a way to weaken the stronghold that an institution like the IDF, it's not, of course, only the IDF, the Israeli society is hyper militarized, as you know. But part of my goal is to do that. And so I kind of jump, and here I'm jumping ahead, but I'll try and make this point clearly. I ask myself, why isn't there more of an effort from quote unquote our side to reach out, for example, the refuseniks, so Israeli Jews who refuse to serve in the IDF? Because they are doing it, of course, on principle. There's some cost. I'm not going to say it's the same cost as a Palestinian. Of course, it's not. But there is a cost. They do. Some of them do end up just leaving entirely and just living elsewhere and never going back. A lot of them are ashamed, or of course, they have to serve a number of prison sentences and so on. So the cost is not zero, is what I'm trying to say. And I think I want more people to follow the leadership, I guess we might say, of one of the leaders of the Gaza Return March, which was, I think, 2, 3 years ago now. And I'll link to everything I'm talking about. I actually had a video conference with them, with a number of Israeli refuseniks, I think covered 2019 or so, and telling them essentially that, you're an inspiration and I thank you. And he was saying that he knows that more people like them are needed. And I see a lot of Palestinians talking like this and thinking like this, but I don't see it often expressed outside of Israel-Palestine. And I think that this is short-sighted, and I think that it ends up really doing or leading to a conclusion that, okay, I'm gonna rephrase this so I don't say it. See, I have to be super careful. So that it doesn't sound like I'm saying, well, if we don't do this, therefore the Israelis are
Yeah,
winning.
I think you're doing it so well, Joey. But yeah,
Thank you. But it's just that if this is the end goal, then I want to explore all options to weaken that authoritarian infrastructure that I'm calling the IDF here, the D in quotation, the defense bit in quotation. One of them might involve physical confrontation. I'm not asking anyone to lay down their arms. I'm not asking anyone to not fight back. Certainly, I believe in the right for oppressed people to defend themselves, so I don't even go there. Um, but I also think it needs to be coupled with these other things. And I think this is especially the responsibility of those of us who are not physically there, because we don't have to fight physically. We don't have to defend our homes. We don't have to expose what's happening on a daily basis in the same way. Um, which is why I think we need to have more of this long term goal. And here I'll briefly plug, before shutting up, that a number of people that I know, I won't say too much about it yet because it's still in the kind of, I will just link it anyway, but I'll working towards re-establishing the PLO, because I mean it still exists, but it's kind of useless, because basically the PA only, the Palestinian Authority, at least they've inherited it, and re-establishing the PLO as a way of having extra pressure. I think this is one of those things that they will have to basically reckon with. And I think most of them, based on what I know from them and obviously their experiences and what they're talking about and thinking about, are very well aware of this. So I would be very much preaching to the choir here. But I wanted to bring this up to listeners who may not be as familiar with the dynamic of what I'm talking about. So anyway, this was longer than I thought it would be, but this is kind of the nature of these impromptu conversations.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I wrote down like again so many things that
Go for it. Go for it.
we
Go
can
for it.
pick up on. I think like the most important thing that I would want to backtrack on for myself, also because you of course spoke about it, is the Holocaust, and how it connects to my identity having grown up. So I think an important trip that I went on that I know a lot of young Jewish people go on is the March of the Living. Um, I think most people go at about like 14, 15. That was kind of the age that I went. So young, developing a sense of self at that point, like kind of learning about yourself in the world much more. It's a very particular age. Anyway, so I went on the March of the Living, and it was taking us to all the concentration camps in Eastern Europe, Prague, and then we went to Israel, to celebrate its independence straight after. And I think there's something so fascinating about the psychology. I know a lot of people have tapped into this, but around having, especially young people at a formative age, witness the remains of the horrors that their ancestors went through, or like, 2 generations up went through. And then to really emphasize to this group of teenagers that the only way that they will survive, really, and make sure that this doesn't happen again, is to have a state in which we can all be safe. And then to like celebrate the independence of that state, to have a really kind of traumatic or painful experience, and then go to Israel in time to celebrate the Independence Day. So I think, yeah, there's something around that like at the time when I was a teenager, I was very settled in the idea of Israel existing, of course, but there were definite disparities between, again, like the version of Zionism that I grew up with, and like another version of Zionism represented at this youth movement that I also went to once off when I was young, about 10 years old. I only went to that camp because my friends were going. My parents didn't want me to go, but I went anyway, and it was a very right-wing camp, that during which people were singing songs about Jabotinsky, etc. And when I came back, my parents said, like, do not sing that song and you'll never go back to this movement. So yeah, like all of that was going on. And while I was at school, we also didn't learn versions of Jewish history that were, from all angles. It was like a very particular narrative. And I remember a friend of mine would like question the teacher in Jewish history studies about, refugees, like what happened to Palestinian refugees, what happened, to the people in the land. And he was really ridiculed, like told to shut up by classmates. The teacher kind of didn't kind of dismissed him. So any mention of Palestinians or of what happened in 48 was not allowed really when we were growing up, both as a social contract, but also just, I think that it just wasn't represented in the books, of course. But I would say, yeah, like the older I got, and especially when I went to university after I left school, I was exposed again to people who were really, really committed to dealing with the consequences of apartheid in South Africa. So, fighting for economic justice, fighting to decolonize the curriculum, etc. So there are lots of people that I met at UCT that through my experiences with them, they also exposed me to kind of angles on Palestine that I hadn't been exposed to before or hadn't thought of. And I decided at one point to kind of explore this more, and felt like, okay, maybe I've misunderstood that, I should just criticize the occupied territories and Gaza. Maybe there's something more. And I would say that when I went to the program that I went to, which was a peace building initiative that was based in the Negev in Israel, where so lots and lots and lots of people have legitimately critiqued it for being kind of a normalizing space, and I absolutely hear that. And the power dynamics, like presenting them as equal, it's problematic. And also, I know that it was through that program and through becoming really close to the Palestinians in the program, it was through that experience that I genuinely got exposed to an alternative to history that I probably hadn't delved into before. And so I would say that it was through their eyes and through hearing stories from them about what their family had gone through and what their families currently go through that I started to realize more and more that all the kind of pieces of the narrative that I had been fed up until that point, or that I had been exposed to up until that point, were not, we're lacking massively. And it was from there that I, started really questioning and kind of experiencing an important cognitive dissonance, I will say. Maybe I'll leave it there for now. I feel like I've been going on for a bit. That's at a certain moment in time in my life.
No, I also took some notes. When I did my master's thesis, one of the chapters was actually looking at the Israeli textbooks, which I don't know if you've done. It's extraordinary. Those are textbooks, specifically Hebrew textbooks. So Hebrew textbooks that are commissioned by the Israeli government to teach people who want to learn Hebrew. And I had one of those books. The borders don't exist as one might see in those international maps. So according to international law, where you would have, West Bank and then Gaza, and then the rest of it is more or less contiguous. This doesn't exist. There's no West Bank border. There is a Gaza border, which I found interesting. So Palestine is basically this tiny strip. And the rest is just written in Hebrew, the name of the cities. So there is Tel Aviv, there's Haifa, there is Jerusalem. One of them had Nablus, which I found interesting, but they didn't say where Nablus was. They just said Nablus. They just got it Nablus. And so that's one thing. The other thing is so that's the map bit. The other thing is that the narratives that are there are what you mentioned: Holocaust, Israel. That's it. That's pretty much it. And the Arabs in all of this, and here I'm putting the Arabs in quotation because that's how they are referred to, Arabim, the Arabs, are just sort of in the mix. Basically the history isn't, which is what many people don't know, that a lot of these textbooks don't treat the history of Israel as a history of a country in the Middle East. It's just physically there, but that's the extent of it. The history of Israel in those textbooks is the history of Europe. It's essentially the history of European Jews specifically. When the Arabs are mentioned, if at all, it's to mention that, well, there were Jews also there and they also fled. That's the extent of it. And I'm not one to say that this doesn't matter. Obviously, it does. If you are a Jewish family from Baghdad and you had to leave Baghdad, that's a legitimate story. I'm not saying, it's part of complicating those multiple threads even more, which I haven't even gotten to the Mizrahi stuff. So okay, that's another thing. One thing while you were talking that
can I also say just before, I just want to actually like really resonates with what you're describing, in that in the diaspora, a lot of the textbooks are exactly what you just put forward. And so one can imagine how deeply rooted this is, right? That's for sure. Like the map excludes so much. The history doesn't include certain, it's just, it's like the word Palestinian, I don't think is ever brought up. The word Palestine is only referenced as like a state of Palestine pre, so there's so much around what you've just described that I would say impact people. And especially if they don't get access to alternative spaces, like I think the one that I went to helped me recognize that was a real deep problem. And if I hadn't had access to that, if I had just gone to the school that I went to, I would say, I can imagine a scenario in which people easily get turned to want to defend, you know, like people who go off to the IDF. And yeah, I think it's crazy because even now we have access to so much information through social media, much more than when I was growing up. And I was thinking about how I wish, you know, people earlier had access to social media because maybe some things would have turned out differently, but who knows. But even so, I think the people who grew up only with access to the kinds of textbooks that you described, who then did not gain alternative voices anywhere, even if they come across things on social media, they will automatically never, I can't imagine a scenario in which they would step out of themselves and believe it and take it seriously. Yeah, and I just wanted to recognize like the levels of different stuff going on here.
Yeah, well, so Molly Crabapple, a good friend of mine, she was also a previous guest on this podcast to speak about her Yiddishist legacy as well, and she's writing a book about it. She tweeted this morning, actually, well, my morning, and I'm quoting, by and large, American Jews, I include myself here, grow up hearing fairy tales about Israel that ought to make a kindergartner laugh. I cannot overestimate the absolute hogwash we hear from the earliest age, to the point where reading a normal history book is world shattering. If you grew up this way, I really, good faith, urge you from the bottom of my heart to read real history of Europe and the Middle East, just so that you can get an adult understanding of the world, as opposed to the childish pap that ends up justifying ethnic cleansing. This goes for every other group that got a dumbass nationalist education about how their people were always virtuous and right. I'm talking about American Jews here because I am one, but we are far from the only culprit here. End quote. End quote. Okay, so I just wanted to put.
Yeah.
It's true,
Yeah.
and
I mean, retweet.
yeah, um, before you were talking about like the link between, very crudely speaking, the IDF and the Holocaust, for example, is that in some ways, if you don't know the history of the region, or you don't know, if you're not Palestinian, you don't have this inherited lived experience. One, if you hear "never again," you can easily, conclude that "never again" means as strong a state as possible with as hyper-militaristic society as needed, because we are always in a state of emergency. We are always about to be attacked. We are always about to be driven to the sea, as I always hear. Um, it's just something that I also kind of take in, because there are multiple dynamics that are very complicated, that sometimes, not often, but sometimes go beyond just colonizer, or that's always in the background. But there are certain things that the colonizers, the occupiers, tell themselves, and this is for me, the great contribution of someone like Yeshayahu Leibowitz that I mentioned before, who mentions basically, let me actually find the paragraph and just read it because it's much better. Yeah, so he wrote in 1968, warning that Israel as a military occupier, quote, would necessarily become a secret police state, with all that this implies for education, free speech, and democratic institutions, end quote. And what he was essentially saying, and this is sort of my reading of it, that you cannot occupy someone for this long without yourselves becoming monsters, essentially. Moral monsters, as James Baldwin would put it. And I think this is crucial, because there is not just the responsibility of quote unquote the international community, whatever the fuck that means, but there is a responsibility of Israeli Jews themselves. And this is something that's very lacking, to put it very, very mildly, right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like as you were talking, I was referencing Fanon in my mind, who obviously did so much work on the psychology of the torturer and the tortured. And I remember learning the line, if you, or not the line, like the thing that he said, that he spoke about, is that if you dehumanize another, you dehumanize yourself. And I would say that like the first time that became really, really vivid to me because I had heard it. I hadn't really applied it so much to Israel-Palestine before. Of course, I understood it in the context of colonialism in Africa, but I hadn't understood it in the context of Israel-Palestine. And so anyway, I knew that line. But then when I was at this peace building program that I was at, that I mentioned earlier, there was the Gaza operation of 2012. And I remember so many, not just like so many things fell apart during that time because of what was exposed in that moment. So all the, like the friendships that had developed, like everyone had to really reckon with what this meant. And I think for the people who were even in relationships, I remember, like who had been together and were dating, and like there were situations where the one was Israeli and was called up to go, and the other one was Palestinian. And I think like in discussion around that, and when they came back and spoke about it, it became clear that for the Israeli in that moment, it was really the first time that he had thought about going into territories that belong to people who are complex and brilliant and artistic, and like they're, because up until a certain point in one's life, if you've had a Zionist education, you are just not exposed to Palestinians as fully fledged humans. And I'm saying it this crudely, just so that the point is brought home.
Actually, sorry, yeah, you're saying it
Is that
crudely, but from the textbooks that I mentioned before, as you said, Palestinians are not mentioned. Occasionally, I know how to say Egyptian and Jordanian in Hebrew before I know how to say Palestinian, for that reason. But the only Arabs that you see are Bedouins in the textbooks, and that's about it. Not that being a Bedouin is not valid, but that's basically the only thing that they show. So it's literally there as well.
Yeah, and I mean with the Bedouins, I think that example is also a really explicit one, because we learn about Bedouins and then experience their quote unquote, culture for a sit down and a tea, and then go back. And again, I really don't mean to make this like make a really, really serious and painful reality like laughable. I really don't mean that. I just mean that these anecdotes indicate how deep it is. And whenever in our lifetime Palestine will be free and we'll have equal rights for everyone, there will still have to be a very, very long process of unlearning. I would say, I don't know a better term than unlearning, for many generations.
Yeah, and I will reference a book that's called The Holocaust and the Nakba, a new grammar of trauma and history that was published in 2018, edited by Bashir Bashir and Amos Goldberg, and forwarded by Ilyas Khouri, the Lebanese writer, which is really interesting in itself. Um, I'll just reference it. I will do an entire thing about it at some point, but essentially, part of what they tried to do is look at two traumatic events, two traumatic memories, without the need to compare them, which people sometimes like to do, and which I really really advise not to. It's a bad thing to do. It just gets you go down rabbit holes that are completely not useful. But putting that aside for now, um, and try and argue that if there is a way forward, part of it at least, without taking away any of the structural and immediate problems that need, and like the occupation being an obvious one, the siege and the blockade being an obvious one, without taking any of that away as being the primary things that also need to happen. At some point down the line, ideally at the same time, less maybe more practically at some point down the line, there would have to be this what you're calling a kind of an unlearning. And I sometimes sit down and just think about how that might look like, because it's less depressing than just focusing on what's happening right now. And of course, this comes from a position of privilege because I have the opportunity to, as it were, turn off. Okay, so wanted to say that. I will also mention something, if that's okay. I mentioned the Gaza return. Yeah, I mentioned that. So one thing that I wanted to bring up, which is relevant to what we're seeing now, not in Israel-Palestine, but in the diasporas and around the world, basically, which is Ghassan Kanafani has this quote that is passed around a lot by people that I think don't actually read the book, but that's a different problem. Of basically saying like the Palestinian cause is not just the Palestinian, or I'm butchering it, but it's not just a local cause or an Arab cause or whatnot, but it's an international cause. And of course, I obviously agree with that. But I think there is an additional component to that. I'm not gonna put words in his mouth. I'm just using it to adapt to what I meant to say, meant to argue. That there is also, of course, a line of thought that Palestine is also a metaphor, and I'll be very careful here because metaphor can also be erasing. If we're only talking about metaphors as though it's not the real place, then that is problematic for the obvious reasons. Um, but it's just a metaphor in actuality, in the sense of how it's mediatized, how it's, um, what kind of emotions it can generate by, random people around the world. And this is where it can get into problematic territory. And this is where me personally, and this is just my own personal obsession, I'm not asking anyone else to share it. I get extremely uncomfortable when I go to certain protests, as I did in London, and I did one in Edinburgh, and I did a couple of them in Paris, and I see things there that make me very uncomfortable. I'm not gonna go into it too much because I don't want, yeah, I'm not gonna get into it too much just because I probably would at some point. But suffice it to say that I think the people that wave Hezbollah flags or Iranian flags or Syrian regime flags or what have you, and I'm being very specific here. I'm not even including Hamas flags, which is a problem, but that's a different one because at least they're Palestinian. There's a legitimacy there that needs to be talked about. That I'm not going to lump them all together. But Hezbollah is not Palestinian as much as they love to pretend they are. The Syrian regime is not, and the Iranian regime is not. And there is a strange bedfellow situation that happens. I'm not gonna blame anyone who doesn't call them out. I'm not gonna tell anyone what to do, what not to do. I'm just saying that personally, I think it's one very damaging reality, especially in the diasporas and often in the West, where this happens. And I think it needs to be tackled because if we don't call out the Iranian regime, the Turkish government regime, whatever, then we're sort of throwing Kurds under the bus, for example. We're throwing Iranian political prisoners under the bus, Iranian minorities, including the Arab minority, which is kind of ironic here, under the bus. And of course, we're throwing everyone who suffered under the Syrian regime under the bus and the Hezbollah party under the bus. And I think we need to do better.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
all I say on that, really. I mean, I know a lot of Armenians who support the Palestinian cause, but who would be very uncomfortable with the Turkish flags for the obvious reasons. It's just multiple things, and it's just reality. I'm not even telling someone don't bring that flag. I mean, I wish I could, but I don't, just out of principle. But it is something that I think about a lot, and it's definitely something that limits my own participation in these spaces. To the point, and I've mentioned this elsewhere, unfortunately, because it really bothers me because this is part of my own heritage. A number of times when I would see white people in London with keffiyeh, I would almost automatically assume they have shit politics. Like it just automatically, just because the bad experiences that I've had on like as soon as Hezbollah or Syria is brought up, they just go full right wing on me, and I don't want to deal with it really. But that's just me. I wanted to bring back our conversation to at least partly what's happening. As I said, this is not a news update. I don't want to just sit and say Israel is bombing the shit out of Gaza, which it is. And I will just link to people from Palestinians from Gaza who are doing this much better than I ever could. And I've been boosting them on Twitter, which is the best thing I can do right now. I'll just link to all of those. I'll literally put a bunch of links in the blog post and in the description of this episode. But there is a specific thing that did go viral a few days ago of young Jewish supremacists, essentially, is what I'm calling them, or Israeli extremists, what have you, chanting death to Arabs. We've seen this, and it's not even new. We've seen this before as well. but the kind of the juxtaposition between the dance that the chant that they were singing in front of the Western Wall with Al-Aqsa burning in the background because some tree caught on fire or something, shocked a lot of people. But I think fewer people kind of saw or looked up what they were chanting about. And here I'll just mention, and this is a translation from Yair Wallah, who is a really good academic who teaches at SOAS as well.
Yes, he's great.
Yeah, and he has a book on Jerusalem, which by the way I recommend. So they were chanting a Kahanist, and if that's okay, Maya, I'll ask you to kind of expand who the fuck Meir Kahane was and that entire thing. But so they were chanting a Kahane revenge song from the biblical story of Samson's. And this is what this line is: "O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my two eyes. Yimach Shemam, may their name be erased," the youths chant. That's what they were repeating. To the tunes, and I'm not even joking, of a 1990s pop Hasidic rock song. And the juxtaposition of the joy, the teenagers and young boys and young men in their 20s, maybe at most, at least like most of them, the videos that I've seen, just chanting so gleefully and so happily while this horrific thing was happening literally behind. And you could see, of course, that those scenes that maybe people already know what I'm talking about, but I will link to this anyway. But the Kahanists are in the Knesset now. And this is a significant development. This is something that I try and focus on as well from time to time. I think it's a significant development because, as an anti fascist, there's a distinctive difference between, let's say, normal or ordinary Israeli supremacy in Israeli politics and Zionist politics and so on, as we've been seeing, past several decades, which is to be opposed and is bad already. I hope people listening to me don't think I'm saying it's not bad. But there is a distinctive added dimension once it becomes openly fascistic. Because the other stuff, okay, I'm not going to get too much into it, but when it gets to the fascistic stage, then you have a situation where you literally have calls for blood. And that's what we're seeing now. And you don't have the respectable oppression anymore. You have everything else in addition to the respectable oppression. That's what I need to emphasize. The respect, I'm putting in quotation. People can't see me do the quotation. Yeah. But of course it's in quotation. That doesn't stop. They actually end up reinforcing one another. That's what ends up happening. So this is a worrying development. So can you talk a bit about the Kahanist folks? And for those who don't know, maybe a bit of that history, just in terms of just presenting it in ways that they can understand.
Yeah, I think it's really important to say that those kinds of Jewish people are like their ideology, their approach to Judaism, their approach to Zionism are very foreign to me, and I because of not being exposed to such extreme views growing up. Like I went to, as I tried to explain earlier, I went to a school that was definitely conservative, definitely right-wing, but more than that, I was more exposed to kind of left-wing Zionism. So definitely I had encountered people who would have been like more on the Kahanist side, and maybe at this point I would say that. So Kahanism is based on Meir Kahane, head of the Jewish Defense League, or he founded the Jewish Defense League, and he held a really extremist ideology that Arab people were enemies of Jewish people, definitely enemies of the state, definitely needed to kind of get off the land, essentially advocating for ethnic cleansing, without using those terms, of course. And so like lots of right-wing people are also very, very religious. And then there are other really religious people who are anti-Zionist. So I'd also like to make this distinction. So a lot of, just on this point, that like Kahanism is a very particular kind of extremism. And you can have like really religious Jewish folks who are not right-wing and in fact wouldn't even necessarily see themselves in relation to the state. They wouldn't want to even acknowledge the state. So I think just important kind of, sets of approaches to Zionism that exist. But like those particular men in that horrifying scene were, both very right-wing, born out of, or kind of obviously kind of very exposed to the views of Meir Kahana or Kahanism more generally. And on top of that are very religious. And so we're singing songs that had references to the Bible, etc. And I think, it's kind of a real double tricky scenario there to deal with these kinds of people, because on the one hand, their Zionism is so political, like they want the state defined for Jewish people, and one can not, it's very, very hard to attempt to even approach that with them ideologically, like they wouldn't step out of themselves. But even then, to be religious, like to believe that the land belongs to Jewish people, and then reference kind of the Bible, is a whole nother thing to really grapple with or argue with. And when it comes packaged like that, I think it's a really, it's a scary reality, right? Kind of what we were talking about earlier on the erasure through narrative of Palestinians, I think comes across really starkly through that particular kind of version of Zionism currently, where like Palestinians are obviously being attacked in the streets and their homes are being marked, etc., etc. So like a real dehumanization in action.
Yeah, yeah. Um, more than, not really more than the bombs, because there's nothing that ever compares to that. But maybe something that we hadn't seen as much, at least in recent years, is the, okay, let me put it this way. When the first and second intifadas were happening, a lot of the people that are now the people who were dancing, the kahanists, those guys, were very young. If some of them would not even have been born yet, because that's how young they are. And so we are dealing with a distinctive additional dimension to what's already been happening that I think needs to be reckoned with. Um, but something that I admit I had I had a lot of difficulties regardless. But this week I'm talking. This is the bit where maybe it's more about the actuality. But the hunting down, essentially, the in Haifa, I think it was like last night or 2 nights ago, we saw like hundreds, if not more than that, of like Jewish people literally hunting for Palestinians, and you hear like screams in the background of the Palestinians actually found, and that sort of thing. And we saw some videos, we saw some stabbings, we saw some beatings, we saw there was fire bombs, Molotov cocktails, everything that it's like really they have been given permission. Basically, this is your time, essentially.
Yeah.
And to be very clear, by giving permission, they are literally given permission. Like the police is literally with them physically, like you can literally see them, and sometimes they participate with them. They very rarely, I haven't seen a single video so far of them actually stopping them. So to be very specific about what's happening here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's firstly blood curdling. I mean, just I get, I mean, it's horrifying. They're really like, I think we're all feeling it very viscerally, even considering it that that's what was happening. And I think like more recently, I've come to these conclusions around the best analogy I have for Israel and for at least speaking personally, like the way that Zionist education functions and like how it's played out now, is that I think like it's so very obvious that in these examples, it's as if a monster has been unleashed, right, and is like just fucking going on a rampage. and who is allowing this monster to go on this rampage? I think we can definitely reference all the financial aid, the support around the world, like the practical support, the tangible support. But I'm thinking psychologically, who is allowing this monster to go fucking loose? And I think it's all the people through Zionist education who really are kind of have been taught to love and defend and honor this monster. Literally, so it's not an abusive. I'm not going to suggest that Jewish people are at all kind of on any level exposed to the level of violence and trauma on the other side, on Palestinian side. So I really, really don't want to give that impression. But I think it's important to say that this monster, this bully in this analogy, is very kind and loving and cool and trendy and wonderful with the people who are taught to love it, or him or her. So in fact, Jewish people feel all the time like safe, like wonderful, go to the beaches in Tel Aviv, go to the clubs, watch this, like feel very safe in this bubble. But then what happens is that you start seeing in these moments, during these horrific events, this bully in front of our eyes that we've been taught to love just kill people, literally kill people, hurt people, torture people, abuse people, and what it's saying to us the whole time, again in this analogy that I hope makes sense, is that it's doing it for us. That we and our brothers and our sisters and our cousins and our uncles and aunts are literally going to die. We are going to be slaughtered if it doesn't behave like this to to what it would say is like the people perpetrating or like causing the violence, the terrorists, in quote unquote. So I feel really, really also uncomfortable, articulating this, but I think it is important, again, just on a psychological level and not like on a necessarily a practical level. But yeah, I think people who even see the abuse in front of them acknowledge that they can see it, literally, they notice it, they observe it, but they really they've been taught to really defend this big bully.
Yeah, it's filtered down. It's packaged in a certain way. It's how almost all of the history, like atrocities that we can think of, have been. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of them. I can easily think of the Bosnian genocide as being a kind of a quintessential example of how it built up and then how it escalated very quickly. I was interviewed yesterday, and the question that the person asked me is like, well, hundreds of extremists marched down city streets chanting death to Arabs. How has Israel's far right become so emboldened? I listed the obvious ones: the international support, Netanyahu, local politics, all of that stuff. I also mentioned that and here I'm quoting myself, which is a bit weird, but I can simply go back to that Yeshayahu Leibowitz essay, because I had quoted the one I mentioned before, from 1968. I can cite the countless intellectuals, rebels, and writers from across the world who have throughout history pointed out how crucial standing one's ground against fascism is. I can jump from Hannah Arendt to the anti-fascist Chris Nopasaran and pass by, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all the way to Bosnia, Syria, Rwanda, and everywhere else. Horrors rarely happen overnight. We've been here before multiple times. We know exactly where this is leading, and we are seeing it live streamed on social media. Here, I will say something that is one of the unfortunate shortcomings of the past 10 years, more or less, basically Arab Spring, post-Arab Spring, post-2011, which is the delinking, forced delinking between the Syrian cause and the Palestinian cause. And I'm calling it delinking because it's a act, like it had to be done physically, actively. Ironically, by both the Israelis and the Syrians. So the obvious one, the occupation of the Golan Heights, this already separates parts of Syrians from the rest of Syria. But and also the other obvious one, the very existence, the lived experience of Syrian Palestinians who are themselves at this point occupying multiple exiles. but the Assad regime as well, its complicity in that, which I go into in other episodes. I won't get into it too much here. Because one thing that I think Syria sort of taught me, and that's not too broad, is that thinking that it can't get worse is not a good indication of whether it will get worse or not. And it's through those stories and then trying to make sense of it all, like the analysis and the essays and whatnot. Some of these essayists are going to be on this podcast as well. Layla Shami, who's a good friend now, Yasin Haj Saleh, some of the other folks. Um, their contribution, the reason why I'm calling it learning from Syria in that way, the Syrian lived experience, I guess I should say, is this emphasis on power and how, if it's allowed to dominate for a certain period of time, long enough, let's say, it ends up consuming everything. And it will seem like it's consuming everything. It's never always everything, but it will certainly feel that way if there's a literal civil war, as in the case of Syria, before the international war and everything else. And it's through that I am sort of very worried about also, what's happening in Israel-Palestine. So it's in addition to what I already know about the history of the land itself, from the Nakba to everything else, and even prior to the Nakba, the British Mandate, Zionism, etc., etc. But specifically, that this is happening right now in 2021, 10 years after the beginning of the Arab Spring, of the revolutions. I've seen some references to them. One of the tweet that's still pinned on my Twitter right now. So if people want to check that out, so it's paradise, paradise, paradise. Oh, my homeland is a paradise. And I actually don't know who started it, but it was popularized in 2011 by a number of Syrians, and there was this massive protest, especially in Homs, where they would basically end up becoming one large dabke and singing that song and that sort of thing. And it's being sung repeatedly in I saw it in Ramallah, I saw it in Jerusalem, I saw it elsewhere. And those are links, cultural links, that don't get talked about as much, including by activists who would be on, let's say, the right side of things in both stories. So like they are, pro-Palestine and they are anti-Assad, let's say. Even within those situations, for the most part, almost only see Syrians, or at least Syrian friends, not even all Syrians, kind of try and make those links, and I feel like they've been struggling with that a lot. And it's something I just wanted to put out there, because a lot of people, and this is where it goes back to the whole Hezbollah, Assad, and that sort of crap, want to de-link the Palestinian story, let's put it that way, in Israel-Palestine, and then just selectively choose who they want to listen to, which Palestinian experience they want to favor over another. And I'm not going to say too much about my own, because I think I've been relatively lucky. But Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and especially Palestinian refugees in Syria, just because since 2011, are often thrown under the bus. And when I mention things like Palestinians are sort of in deep shit in Lebanon, and Palestinians are even deeper shit in Syria, I see some resonance there, but you feel like it doesn't really translate anyway, because it doesn't fit any kind of these preconceived big narratives, headlines. And this is one of the many, many things that really frustrates me, and why I chose to sort of bring this out in a podcast, in a kind of an audio format, rather than tweets, because tweets can just be misquoted. And I have more on that, which for now I just pause it because I don't go too much into that rabbit hole. I'm wondering, I remember we talked about this, might have been at SOAS, because I was probably just thinking about this a bit too much, during the thesis writing and stuff. I saw the signs even back then of how there is a growing disconnect between a growing rift, one might say. A lot of the I focus especially on Jewish Americans, and Jewish Israelis, let's say, or Jewish Americans and their relationship to the state of Israel. Let's put it that way. We've seen this really change in the past, I want to say 6, 7. I mean, around 2014 during the war in Gaza, and you had the Ferguson stuff happening there. All of those stuff that would then become Black Lives Matter more openly. I started seeing those signs, if you want. Jewish Voice for Peace. Bernie, despite all of his shortcomings, is something that he would, repeatedly say. And the fact that he was the only major Jewish candidate having basically the only relatively decent position on Israel-Palestine kind of was too obvious to ignore, essentially. So, yeah, I'm wondering from your perspective, kind of inhabiting those spaces in one way or another, or at least having more direct link than I do, how have you seen this sort of change in the past, let's say, decade? And how can what's the potential of it? Let's put it that way, in your view.
Ooh, yeah, I would say I've had much more engagement with the progressive anti-Zionist Jews in the UK. So I know less about like Jewish Voices for Peace, though I think that they're doing incredible work. But like my experience was with a really cool group, and maybe we can link to Judas afterwards. But while I was at SOAS, I met some people who then connected me to people from this group that focuses on having, as you described earlier, kind of a general anti-fascist approach that deals with, focusing on, a range of different oppressions around the world. One of which includes Israel-Palestine. It's a very important one. It's especially important to Judas members because of our inculcation into Zionist education, etc. But they focus on kind of, firstly, on a political level or a political and ethical level, they focus on different oppressions, not just, in this one. So it's kind of, it's bolstered or it's strengthened by learning about where other oppressions are taking place. And as a group, it focuses on kind of understanding anti-Zionism, not merely through kind of a one-directional way, so just like, okay, we are against the state, but rather by posing to whoever wants to come along, sometimes Jewish, sometimes not Jewish, that there are so many more Jewish histories that haven't been taught, that haven't been told around the world. And so actually it's not just like being anti-Zionist, it's about saying like, there are other opportunities, there are alternatives, there are ways of being in the world that do not have to mean that you have to be in the States. Like it offers these kind of concepts or ideas that I think for lots of people it felt pretty new. But in fact, we know that kind of this way of thinking connected to the Yiddish land or like the Bund, this way of thinking of saying like oppressions around the world are terrible. We need to like deal with them all. It's part of being firstly Jewish, kind of not religiously, but just in terms of principle, Jewish values. We have to believe in social justice. This is what we're going for. And also this idea of here-ness, like that's what Judas is rooted in, but that's what like the bigger concept is, which I think again offers this alternative to young or whoever it is, any Jewish person around the world who is questioning and wanting to consider alternatives. What about like having a rich Jewish identity that is also a rich identity of being in the place that you are and getting really involved in understanding and committing to the homeland that you're in, i.e. wherever you land, not in terms of national borders, etc., but wherever your feet lands, like there's your immediate community, there's the place where you can contribute. And so I've read like quite a few pieces criticizing this like supposedly trendy move towards like Yiddish land or revolutionary Yiddish land, but actually I think the people critiquing it or like making light of this concept or saying like people who who are reading about this and are inspired by it are kind of naive. I think those are people who don't want to let go of the the way things have been and the way things are, and so they just they just want to discredit. But in fact, I think it's a very powerful vision, something that I'm not sure has been taken on by groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. I think they're focused on highlighting the human rights violations that take place on a daily basis, on bringing attention. I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. Um, and it goes without saying almost. But I think that there's this other level of kind of not just focusing on the human rights violations in a place that speaks in your name, but also focusing on nurturing a new vision, like a new way of being in the world that will help everyone to be more equal, help our world hopefully to be fairer.
Yeah, for sure. I was in Chicago a couple of years ago, and I did meet a number of activists from If Not Now, who I feel are more aligned even than Jewish Voice for Peace with that sort of worldview. Although I mean, I support them all because I had presented part of that thesis, so it was in the context of Yiddish and Hebrew and all of that, and I had taken, well, I didn't really take a Yiddish class. I just attended while people were learning Yiddish for a couple of weeks at London, just as part of my case study, let's say, and I spoke to a number of the students who were learning Yiddish. One of them was Israeli, and she just said she was Israeli Australian and she was just wanting to learn the language that her mom spoke to her in. So, fine. And but the others, which was what I was looking for in my thesis, basically said that it's a way of reconnecting to something which they feel has been forcibly erased. And I spoke about this much more in the episode with Molly, so I'll just link to that one for those listening. Just write in Yiddish in the, or Molly, you'll probably find it in the search bar. But it's something that, so going back to the first, even the beginning of our conversation, of seeing those narratives, because I initially went into, I just wanted to see what was happening, because there was something weird happening. I had sort of read about it in different places, stumbled upon it, not really known what it was about. But I had read this story, which I think is confirmed to have actually happened, but I'm not entirely sure. But the fact that it's been told a number of times is interesting in itself. And I mentioned this story in the Mali episode, the episode with Mali, of there was this fighter from the Jewish resistance against the Nazis who traveled to the then nascent state of Israel, like 49 or something, super, like very soon after. And she gave a speech, probably talking about her experiences, something like that. And she gave that speech in Yiddish. And most of the people, or all of the people in the audience, understood her because they were themselves from Ashkenazi background, from Eastern European background, and they spoke Yiddish, or at least understood Yiddish. And then what happened is that, so she got applause, standing ovation, whatever. But happened is that then the person who came after her, who turned out to be David Ben Gurion himself, thanked her for the speech, but then said in Hebrew something along the lines of, like, unfortunately, she spoke in a foreign, grating language or something like that. And one thing that baffled me much, much more than um, maybe, I mean, much more because I already knew about the Nakba, not because it's worse than the Nakba. It's not, but I just did not know how obsessive it was in the 30s, 40s, especially 40s, 50s, and I think about the 60s, possibly 70s, although I'm not sure there, but definitely 40s, 50s, 60s. How many groups of Israelis, usually Israeli youth, were actually tasked to essentially police the spoken language. Because the entire point was that Hebrew was this, as they called it, in the old new language at the same time. Of course, in that essentially we are creating a new identity. We are the new sabras, especially those that were born in the land after 48. And we have to let go of everything that came before it. With, you know, Mizrahis or their ancestors, especially, it was Arabic for the most part. You know, have to stop speaking it. You have to at least, or maybe speak it only at home, but not on the streets. On the streets, we only speak Hebrew. Same happened with Yiddish, same happened with Russian, same happened with a number of other languages. And I think that this tells a story that is almost as revealing as the more obvious stuff. Yeah, colonization, erasing, destroying villages, all of that stuff. The fact that this was also coupled with we need to hold down the fort, we need to inculcate, we need to impose essentially an ideology that comes with a narrative that comes with the ideology. There was one scholar that said that, I forgot what it was, but Israel did not invent Hebrew, modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew invented Israel, something along those lines. I'm probably butchering it. But yeah, so that entire
Yeah.
worldview, that entire world, sorry, is something that for me was what really clicked. As soon as I heard that,
Uh,
then it's like, if it was that aggressive, because there were like militant groups on the streets, like there's one Israeli scholar who's mentioned how her father used to be spat on because he spoke Yiddish. There's another one who mentioned, I mean, those who spoke Arabic is kind of a more well-known story, I suppose. But I just found it fascinating that they were also doing this with Yiddish. Because with
yeah.
Arabic, in my mind, it's like, well, of course, I mean, they hate Arabs, so they're gonna root out Arabic. But with Yiddish as well, and most of the
Yeah.
founders were themselves Yiddish speakers, and it's something that for me really, really kind of hit home that point, if you want, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so much. Firstly, I did just want to shout out Molly because she's amazing. I mean, her work is okay. But wow. Yeah, the erasure, I think it's so fascinating that you brought this up. And again, I think we can understand the realities today and history through kind of this like this lens of what of psychology being passed down, right? From so when I think people talk about collective psychology, but it's kind of not taken so seriously or seen as a yeah maybe not an important component of the struggle, definitely. But if you think about what those um, those examples that you described did to people psychologically, is that they learned to kind of, it's a strange thing, like hate themselves, um, or where they come from at least, and what they've been through. And in hating themselves, they have to create this new identity that will just offer the opposite of this poor victim who ended up not being able to save itself. And so the collective psychology of we have to create this new identity. Okay, we are all these things that our the Yiddish ancestors weren't. We're resourceful and we are strong and we are all of these adjectives to describe kind of the alternative to the people who are the downtrodden, essentially. And so it feels like that narrative of what you've just described won, whereas there was this other narrative going on at the time, which was we are the downtrodden, and therefore we ally ourselves with the downtrodden. Like, we are the downtrodden. Yes, we've had really horrific experiences, and therefore no other human being should go through what we've gone through, and we should fight to make sure that other people kind of lead a better existence than we had to endure. And it feels like that narrative clearly lost, but it's still there. And I think, like, you asked me a question earlier about my hope for the future, I think, or like kind of the way forward. And I think, like, just I know I referenced Judas earlier, but it offers also a trip. I don't mean to advertise. I haven't been involved for many years, but this is really formative for me, is that they offer a trip called Birth Wrong, that obviously plays on this trip called Birthright that lots of young Jewish people from around the world are offered in order to explore and kind of have a fun time in Israel, essentially. So Birth Wrong offers the alternative. It says, we have not been given the stories of, or had access to the stories of, Jews from Spain, Jews from Portugal, Jews from Morocco, Jews from Iran, Jews from Iraq. We haven't, because we've had this very, and then again, I'll use this term, Ashkenormative kind of perspective on things. But then there's obviously this added layer where Yiddish is Eastern European and people, supposedly white as well. So what is going on there? Is it like there's racism on the one hand, and then but in relation to this, it's like a classism. It's like we want to build ourselves up. I don't know. There's something strange around the psychology of people. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. So going on birth wrong is what I want to say is so important, because when we go, we say, wow, okay, we've got this incredibly rich dynamic. Even there were years of really fruitful relationships between Jewish people and their communities around them. Like, wow. In addition to creating new alternatives for the future, I think what this is doing is it's offering alternatives to history, offering alternative individuals to kind of reference and look to. And and I think kind of if we're really wanting a way forward, that's I'm not looking at it from a political lens, but again, like to unlearn, we're going to have to deal with these like racist and classist kind of narratives as well that we were fed, essentially.
One thing that the same research I did also led me to is not in any kind of in-depth, but so it started with a lot of readings, and then it ended up just listening to lots of songs, sung in Ladino, the language of well, Thessaloniki Jews especially, but others in the region as well. Um, as someone who speaks Spanish, I mean, anyone listening who speaks Spanish will understand most of Ladino. It sounds basically like Ladino with some Hebrew words in it. It's actually pretty interesting. Um, but for me, it was just a fascinating addition to understand that there was such a thing as Judeo-Arabic. There was such a thing as Ladino, and there are people who still speak both. I'm not gonna erase them, but of course, numbers are significantly reduced. And it's just such a much more interesting history than, you know, everything was bad, now things are good, which is pretty much, I mean, kind of, okay, bit caricaturized, but that's sort of how Zionism is taught in these textbooks that I looked at. Um, because the idea of birth wrong, which was one of the case studies that I used, um, you know, whatever critiques might be presented, probably, I don't know, I haven't also looked at it in years, but I just like the idea that, Andalusia is a Jewish region. It has a Jewish heritage in that sense. Thessaloniki, Marseille, I'm forgetting a lot of them, but that there were these multiple spots outside of what we now think of as Israel-Palestine that were very Jewish and that were having a huge and rich in culture, diversity and so on. And weirdly enough, it does tie into the whole Yiddish stuff that I mentioned before, because one thing, and it's a sentence that really stuck with me, that one of the Israeli scholars that was like using in my research, I can't remember the name now, but there were, so I want to say he, I'm not sure now, but let's say he was writing about the history of Yiddish and the reception by many Zionist leaders um, of what to do with Yiddish, let's say politically, what to do with that language, because there was then the question of whether should we just have a new one completely, or at least should we impose the new one completely? Let's put it that way. Hebrew, modern Hebrew. There's a sentence that Yiddish stank of the ghetto, which is the sentence that was used. And because there was this contrast, and other people who have done this analysis much more in depth than I have, of the sabra, again, the figure being a male figure, being a hyper militarized figure, kind of like put on you, kind of a cowboy, your own bootstraps kind of situation, that sort of thing. And cowboy specifically, white American cowboy, I should say. Um, but in contrast, that figure was always contrasted with like effeminate almost, and here I'm using a term that they would use, Yiddish speaking Jew of the ghetto. And this is something that also was very, I don't know if the word is surprising, but definitely very, like, it stuck with me for a long time. That, like, at the end of the day, the people following the story who created the state shortly after the Holocaust, a lot of them, not all of them, I'm not gonna caricaturize, but a lot of them, it was definitely hegemonic ideology, really hated what came before. Not the horrors that came just before, but even what came before that. The entire legacy of just what was built over thousands of years, especially over the past 1,000 years, let's say, the Yiddish language, the Ladino language, all of that stuff. And I'm not even including Judeo-Arabic, because for the most part they did not think about what would end up becoming the Mizrahi Jews. It was just not part of the idea. It was just not there. So that's a different story. But yeah, so I wanted to put all of that. That for me, I would listen to these Ladino songs. While there are lots of Ladino lullabies that are amazing, people can look them up on YouTube. Ladino is spelled like Latino but with a D, by the way. And it's not Ladin, which is a language in Italy. It's a different language, Ladino. So anyway, uh, closing that
Yeah.
chapter, it was just something that was in the back of my mind often when I was doing that research.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I've also noted down the Ladino songs that I'm going to try to check out. My Spanish is very rusty. I don't know if you know, I spent a gap year in Argentina many years ago, and so I've tried to get back into it. But I think maybe listening to Ladino songs will kind of help. But yeah, I think it's just becoming so clear that the long-term project is um, a kind of re-inculcating a different narrative. Like there's a real need for or not even different. What I would say is an expanded narrative, like a mindset shift can only take place if more stories are told about the different Jewish people around the world. If in schools and in youth movements and in family, Shabbat dinner conversations, if there could be this new way of identifying with our ancestors across the board who came from a range of different places and understanding kind of the ways to feel proud without it having to manifest itself in this gruesome, grotesque, hyper nationalistic, hyper militaristic way. Like there should be an alternative option that is presented. I think we're maybe moving in that direction more and more, and that's really exciting. But we're up against strong forces, so it'll take a lot to expose people, Jewish people. I'm talking about like places that would typically be Zionist, to expose, or even I'll say like the more Ashkenazi settings in particular, that because there's, and I won't even get into the fact that in Israel, you may know that the Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews are also pretty right-wing. I would say kind of are generally leaning more towards right-wing or extremist.
And that the
And I
majority
think
of the
that's all.
Jewish population.
Yeah, and I think, well, yeah, and there's that trauma that is the result of having always been treated in the way that we described earlier. And I wouldn't take it for granted that those are also the people who are, kind of fiercely committed to the army and the state, etc., because they really, really want to prove themselves on a collective level, or kind of go against all the stereotypes that were cultivated.
Well, historically, minorities are almost always overrepresented in armies. In America, is also the case. In the case of Israel, it's not necessarily a minority, but I forgot what was the term, but it's like rendered into a de facto minority despite the numerical majority. Let's put it that way, due to the Ashkenormative, as you called it, domination. Um, that kind of brings me into something. Maybe I won't get into it too much because I don't feel as capable, but I've been slowly getting into more like the history of Jews in the Arab world, Jewish Arab history, Mizrahi history, as some people might say today. Although Mizrach, for those who don't know, just means east, so it doesn't really say much. But okay, let me see how to phrase this. I think there is a specificity to the Mizrahi experience Ethiopian Jewish experience, Yemeni experience. I actually don't remember if Yemenis are lumped in with the Mizrahis. I think they are, but not always. Anyway, there are these multiple experiences that need to have a different lens than just anti-colonial. Oh no, let me put it this way. In order for the anti-colonial lens to be more complete, it needs to also include, or anti-colonial slash anti-authoritarian, it needs also to include the specificity of those experiences. Because I've met people, and this is something I didn't really know, honestly, and I want to say that most Arabs don't know, and this might, involve some unlearning on our side. But I want to say that, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm just saying it now. Um, that there isn't a strong awareness of what exactly uh, went wrong before most Jews in the Arab world and Arab Jews left, many of whom migrated to Israel, as we know, some to Europe and America and elsewhere. But I had met some people in London, especially a number of Baghdadi Jewish families or Baghdadi Jewish people who belong to those families whose experiences I genuinely did not know. And I did not know how bad it was at one point, especially in the case of Iraqi Jews. But, that also, of course, I was in the same environment, if you're on the same mood, as just looking up a lot of anything related to Judaism and to Jewish history. And so I was looking all over. And then when I went into Syria, into Lebanon, into Egypt, Yemen, that's when I started seeing those erasures that I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation popping up again. Because assuming we go with the story that my grandmother is Jewish, is this idea that I've had in my mind of like, why is it in Lebanon right now? And this is kind of off topic from what we're talking about, but I think it does intersect in an interesting way. Why would Jewish friends of mine that did visit Lebanon sort of have to hide their Judaism? They couldn't express it too openly. They certainly didn't wear anything that had any kind of like Star of David or anything like this. Now, obviously, the trauma of the Israeli occupation and bombardments and all of that, given that that came literally with the Star of David on the flag, is part of the story, and I don't want to remove that. But I think there's also something more there that I think we need to look at. So I'll just kind of put it there. I will do more specifically in-depth episodes on like focusing on Lebanon, like the history of of like Lebanese Jews and Jewish history in Lebanon, because there's quite a lot that most people, including especially most Lebanese, I would say, really don't know anything about. So I just kind of put it out there. Um, I'm wondering how if we can sort of, I don't know if this is a bit of an awkward segue, I don't know, but a broader conversation I wanted to have on the sort of the links that we were talking about before. We brought up South Africa, although we didn't really get into it as much. Of course, as you know, Israel is compared to an apartheid state in number of Human Rights Watch famously about a month ago released that report, which I highly recommend. I went through parts of it. It's much more detailed than I thought it would be. Concluding that the Israeli policies constitute apartheid. Given your specific positionality here, how do you sort of navigate that question? Not whether yes or no, because I think we'll just say yes, but how do we think about it? How do you think about it?
Sure. I think that's a really, it's an important question because there are so many things that are going on at the moment in Palestine that are quite distinct because of technology, because of the military situation, like the arms, etc., that were quite distinct. And so I think that when understanding what happened in South Africa in comparison with what's going on now, it's important to recognize that there are incredible, stark, horrifying parallels, many of which are just obvious, like the denial of human rights, kind of privilege for the minority, violations against the majority. Like there are so many things that are parallel to apartheid South Africa. But I also think that sometimes it can be quite restrictive in the ways that I think I referenced earlier. So like, obviously, I'm again, absolutely not attempting, as you said, like you referenced this earlier, I would never attempt to compare people's pain. Like there's no way of, yeah, like, yeah, but what I'm saying is that I think apartheid sometimes in reference to Israel-Palestine doesn't capture the full extent because there are other added dimensions that currently exist. But yeah, I mean, I think like they are, like I was watching this film the other day. I think it just won an Oscar about Fred Hampton. I can't remember its name now, but it
Talking
was
about
really
Judas and the Black Messiah.
Black Messiah,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's a good one.
Yeah. And I was watching it and I was thinking about the parallels between the experiences represented on screen there based on history, between that and what was happening in South Africa, especially related to kind of infiltrators, spying, incredible sense of like who to trust while developing a movement, kind of, yeah, constant fear, etc., etc. There's so many parallels, and also parallels to what's going on in Israel-Palestine, again, in terms of infiltrator, like traitor, who's spying on who. Like there's a lot of that going on. So I think what I'm trying to also say, and this again connects with what you were talking about earlier really powerfully, is that they are so, I think there are opportunities to flatten what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And one of the ways to do that is also to not to use the word apartheid. I'm not talking about its usefulness kind of in legal political terms. I'm just saying in our construction of what's going on, I think it can be, yeah, it's not as expansive, but it can, as I said, help us draw those parallels.
No, for sure. I know of good critiques of how it doesn't go far enough, essentially. One obvious difference is that for the most part, like South African whites needed South African blacks for their labor. That was an obvious dynamic there happening. Whereas in Israel Palestine, it's not as clear, essentially. And the numbers, of course, as well. But anyway, yeah, I know. I'm myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
No. I was just no. I was yeah. I was just going to touch on those dimensions. I was yeah. I think you've touched on important points.
Yeah, so it's just something to keep into account as well. Of, I'm not advocating not using it. I use it myself. Just sort of keep in mind that there might be a practical use for it, so that people understand that this is a. It's sort of like how I know of many Palestinians actively making links with Black Lives Matter, for example. I think, and with the entire history of African American oppression in the United States, it's a way of also showing, I think it's like we're telling ourselves as well that we can overcome, to use that song, uh, because it's very important. And maybe I'll sort of use that to wrap up in a, I don't know if it's optimistic to say in an optimistic way, we'll see. But
I also wanted, I just, before you go there, I just I wanted to just like clarify maybe something that I didn't say clearly enough, which is that the term apartheid definitely does help us understand how incredible damage can be done to a society economically, you know, in all the ways. And so I think it really does help us kind of, I think with South Africa, given what it's going through at the moment, the degrees of poverty, you know, the fact that we're still kind of reeling all these years. I mean, it hasn't been, I suppose, that long, it's all relative, but South Africa is still going through a lot that are the effects of apartheid that took root for so many decades. And so I think definitely in that respect, using the term apartheid in reference to Israel-Palestine, both shocks as it should, and it also allows us to recognize like damn, okay, it's going to be a long journey ahead. I know you were going to wrap up in a kind of more hopeful note, so maybe I'll come back to that kind of tone in a bit.
Yeah. No, I agree. Of course, I agree. And I would like to always emphasize that when I try and think of quote unquote solutions, it's not even really solutions. It's more that I'm just trying to explore imaginaries, different imaginaries. Some of them might be useful, others might not. Um, it's not really up to me to say, to be honest, but I do think there's a lack of it. There's a lot of good writing and like an analysis of why there is a sort of a not a complete lack that exists, but there's a relative lack of, like, for example, science fiction and fantasy and that sort of thing in the Arab world, written in Arabic specifically. And one argument is that just that reality was always too overwhelming to have time to think about fantasy and science fiction. I mean, in order to be someone like, Tolkien, just to name an obvious Lord of the Rings one, uh, he had a lot of time on his hand. It's just, he was at Oxford, all of that. There was just a lot of things that were put in place in some ways, or were already there, that allowed him to have this kind of imagination without taking away his own contribution towards that, obviously. But this lack of imaginary to me is why I'm trying so actively, or as much as I can, which is not easy, to think of scenarios and things of context and think of stories, even imagining situations where it's kind of like the solar punk aesthetic that I'm trying to adopt as well, which for those who don't know, there's an entire episode on it that you can look up, but sort of imagining what would the planet look like if we had either solved climate change or mitigated climate change, or if we're dealing with it, but we are dealing with it in a better way, let's put it that way. And so it's definitely not naive, but it has a sort of inherent chosen optimism, if you want, just because the alternative isn't really making much of a difference. And so what's the link to Israel-Palestine? Well, there isn't a direct one, because as I said, I would never put myself in a position where I would tell people who, especially those who live there, this is what should happen, this is what shouldn't happen. That's not even how I think, to be honest, but I need to clarify that anyway. But it's just something I think can be useful because I've seen it being used elsewhere. Um, so the optimist,
Absolutely.
yeah, sorry. The optimistic note here is just that there are ways of thinking about different ways of being. Let's put it that way. Birth wrong is one. There's also a way of using comedy and using humor, I should say, to go against hyper nationalistic jingoism. But even the more light forms of nationalism as well, which I also think can be very damaging. So I do imagine when I sit down right now and I imagine that there is a situation where you can have a land that's called whatever you want to call it Israel, Palestine, call it Palestine, whatever, where you do have people, Jews and Arabs, to use this kind of, yeah, Jews and Arabs living there with equal rights and everything, and actually having exchanges towards a new identity. And for those who think this is not possible, which I would not blame you if you do, again, I'm not here to convince anyone, but I would just reference the African American story of how, in James Baldwin's own words, that part of the solution is that white people need to understand that my ancestors are their ancestors as well. And obviously, he didn't mean this in a biological sense, but sometimes yes, he also meant it that way. And he said it in the sense that if you don't, I can use a good analogy here. That's a good one. The fact that African Americans are excluded from the quote unquote American dream is why the American dream will never be possible. Because those that are excluded from it will wreck it. I'm almost quoting him here. I haven't memorized it exactly, but it's something along those lines. And the parallel here is that Israeli Jews who think this is how they will be safe need to look at almost any place ever, almost anywhere in history that have even remotely similar circumstances and realize that it never ends well for the oppressors. It's already not ending well for the oppressed, but it doesn't end well. It really doesn't. and there has to be a way of going beyond that. And I'm not saying I have the solution. I definitely do not. But I'm just saying it's what I'm trying to think about, because other than that, I'm just, depressed and helpless, and things are bad and things are getting worse kind of situation, which as of now they are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's important also to say that, like, considering the mindset shift and the constructing of imaginaries that help us gain momentum and get to a certain point. Also, it's really important to call out the human rights violations and to report and to and I know that we're saying that, like, so I think when people criticize the offering of this type of solution, perhaps what they're not realizing is that it's kind of seen as a supplement to, or kind of a bolstering of, a range of other things that are being, considered as part of, I'm not talking about this, like what it will finally look like, the construction, but like all the day-to-day ways in which people are struggling, are very practical. And then along with that, like along with the legal challenges and the human rights research reports and the trips showing alternative, like along with the practical stuff going on, there does need to be like this mindset shift and an opportunity to construct and build and strengthen. And I think, like, being an educator, I don't know. I think we don't realize exactly how much school shifts and shapes us. Like, I think a lot of people have put a lot of time and effort into parenting, and of course that's very legitimate. And I don't mean to comment. I'm not a psychologist and don't have a therapy background, but like, schooling really impacts people's experiences, and so do informal educational experiences, of course, like all the friends one meets and the tours and the camps, etc. So I think if we're able to really go into those kinds of spaces and see it as kind of an offering of a new way of thinking about this issue, kind of expanded version of approaching it, while also holding Israel accountable and supporting boycott, divestment, sanctions, etc., etc. I think together that could be something that we can hope for, inshallah, in our lifetime, but
Yeah,
if not, for
yeah,
future generations.
yeah. And thanks for adding that. I'm always paranoid that I may sound like I'm both siding something, and I'm never always sure as to whether just being Palestinian is enough for people to know that that's not what I'm doing. But yeah, I guess I would just say that there's a disproportionate number of refuseniks, those I mentioned that refused to serve in the IDF, that went to bilingual schools, Hebrew and Arabic schools. I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think we should see this as a coincidence. And I don't think we should see it as a coincidence either that the Israeli government is so heavily invested in making sure that there is a more or less coherent narrative from a very young age that ties into pretty much all of Jewish history, summarized in a few, 100 pages, that conveniently, supports the official state narrative.
Yeah,
So it's
I
all,
would also
yeah,
say I think
yeah.
like, programs are normalizing when they don't recognize that like half the participants, whatever the scale is, half the participants have literally more rights than other people in that room, literally have the state and the military behind them. Like, if you don't recognize those power dynamics in that room, then I think that really is feeding into this both sides really problematic way of speaking about this. But I think, like, I don't think it's coincidental that the refuseniks are also those who went to schools that were not insular. So I think, yeah, like, I'm wondering about a scenario in which more and more of those kinds of, I don't know, opportunities arise, but while I think it's very aspirational, especially at this moment in time. So it's even hard to imagine it, but I think it's important to imagine them.
I think honestly it's fair to say, and I think I would hope, although I don't see it at all, but maybe more of it, that those who are in the quote unquote international community who say that they don't want to support BDS because X, Y, and Z. The fact that they don't even see, which for the record I obviously support BDS, but those people who don't even think of proposing alternatives, and they really think that the only position that they should have is essentially stay in line, stick with the troops, hold down the fort essentially. I'm tired on their behalf. I think this is something that they need to get over with. They need to really move on. And I will say that part of this podcast, or in small capacity, obviously, but there will be some efforts, on that front as well. Some recorded, some not recorded, for security reasons. But it's something that I'm looking at, because honestly, I need to find some ways, and that's maybe just for me, purely selfishly, maybe I don't know, but I need to find some ways of thinking that this can change in a certain way, and because again, otherwise, then we're just hoping that someone like the Americans will suddenly decide to turn on the Israelis, and maybe this is going to make a difference. So to be extra clear on the both side thing, everything I just said is in addition to everything that's already happening right now on the ground. It's not to supplement it. It's not to say, well, they should not protest in a certain way. Not at all. I actually think there should probably be more of it. I think that should be organized. It should be strategic. It should be, the usual stuff that I advocate for in any situation, to be honest. But yeah, I just wanted to make, and I have to be a bit paranoid about this just because, it is being recorded. So I don't want people to misunderstand.
No, of course. And I also think I hope that by having unpacked all of these really, really deeply rooted problematic aspects, I'm not seen in any way to be justifying them again. And I think it goes back to what you said right at the start. Yeah, the erasure and the dispossession it should be at the forefront in the current bombings, the realities there. And yeah, we hope for better days. And I also support BDS. And yeah, I think I think quite a few people, even if they're not openly BDS supporters in the more conservative Jewish spaces, I think are secretly like,
something has
put some sanctions on this. Yeah.
That's what I'm sort of hoping, because that's where the political shift anyway may happen more dramatically than elsewhere. It is very significant. It's kind of speaks to this more positive note as well. But I do think that, especially in the American context, things have shifted pretty significantly, as we mentioned before. It's probably not gonna translate itself into actual policy. That's just the nature of bureaucracies and politics in America and most of the world, to be honest. But it is something that I want to look at, because it is just a fact that if you go 10 years ago, the vast majority of progressive Jewish organizations wouldn't even exist, or at least were not that active. And now they are, and this matters. It matters a lot. It would matter even more, of course, if the equivalent of that was happening among Israeli Jews. I don't want to belittle that either, but it's something. It's something, and I have this predisposition to sort of see it. There's something that is there rather than the nothing that isn't. That is whatever. I fucked up my own metaphor, but yeah, you got what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will sort of. Usually, I ask guests to recommend books. If you have any, feel free. I will just briefly say, I want people to read Ghassan Kanafani's Returning to Haifa. I want people to read it because I'm from Haifa, partly from Haifa, and because returning to Haifa has always been something that is, or at least since I became more aware of that heritage, something that I've been thinking of how that would look like, in what situation would it be, for example, in a situation where I have to hide my Lebanese-ness and just use a foreign passport and maybe hope for the best that it doesn't get, flagged or whatever. Or is it a situation where pretty much justice has happened in Israel-Palestine, refugees are allowed to return, things are amazing now, or whatever, and then I can return? Because, I'm turning 30 soon and I have to think of myself in that way as well. It's just one of those things. But I would recommend that book. It has nothing to do with me turning 30. If anyone's confused, it has nothing to do with any of this. It's just a really good novel by Ghassan Kanafani, who was assassinated by the Mossad in Beirut, I should say. And the other book, I already mentioned it, which is the Holocaust and the Nakba. I will link all of this in the description. I highly, highly recommend that book. It does things that I think are very new. Most of what I'm talking about is really around the time I started my thesis, so 2014, 15, 16, I think is when it started. I think I was just at the right place at the right time. And I think people need to kind of explore this kind of these books. I think they should just read these books. I'm kind of repeating myself a bit. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Also going to note these down. I think like clearly in relation to what's going on at the moment, there are lots and lots of resources out there. So I wouldn't want to, I don't know, like say this is the one place to get to like read about, what's happening. But what I wanted to plug was Diana Naum, who we both know from SOAS, has a resource list up that is like really well structured and kind of offers a lot of texts on the issue by various journalists, authors, etc. And then also Jewish Currents for anyone who wants to also see what they're putting out there. They've got a range of they have like a thing called a Shabbat list, a reading list, and they've got on their reading list like a lot of contributors kind of reckonings, I think I'll say, but other things as well. They have a great set of resources. And then in terms of novels, not novels, I would say the one is a novel, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but the other one is this Revolutionary Yiddish Land, a history of Jewish radicals or Jewish radicalism. I think it's like more than an analysis. I mean, it provides like a bit of an analysis at the beginning, but more than that, it's like historical testimony and stories about different participants in the Bund, people who had who were radical communist or socialist Jews. And I think it's like structured in a really interesting way in that like it's got all these different chapters. So if you're trying to get a neater understanding of like I suppose Doikite and other like those kinds of philosophies, I would say this book probably isn't it, because it's more about like the stories. But if you want some insight into how it was actualized by people in the past, I think it's a really great one. And then the other book that I want to plug is not connected to Israel-Palestine, but it's an incredibly rich, beautifully researched book, and it's called Homegoing by Yag Yassi. And it's about generations of families whose stories are told in relation to how they experienced slavery from Ghana and then how they came to the US. And it's just, it's historical fiction. So obviously the characters she constructed, I think, but I'm sure, I mean, she did so much research, like so much of it is connected to historical moments in time. And so I think anyone who maybe wants to take like like a break from one really painful history and read about it and find out more about another, if people have the emotional and I wouldn't say energy, I'd say that capacity at this point or interest. It is beautifully written and yeah, it's done in a really accessible way. So I'd highly recommend that as well.
Amazing. Well, on that note, Maya, thanks a lot for chatting with me. It was a long but hopefully productive chat for listeners.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joey. It was great to chat to you.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.